Hello, I'm Keith Hocton. I've been inundated by listeners asking about Art Deco. What is it, where it came from, and why it feels so irresistibly modern. A good friend of mine, Nicky Almasi, is finishing a stunning coffee table book on the subject, and after talking with him about his passion, one that I'll have to admit I share, I figured it was time to do an episode on it. Because Art Deco isn't just about style, it's a story, a moment in time when the world was rebuilding after the First World War, when people wanted glamour, speed, and modernity. It's a slice of history, I think, written not in dusty archives, but in marble, in chrome, and in glass. You can see it in the skyline of New York, in the sweep of a 1930s ocean liner, even in the curve of a cocktail shaker. Born out of the chaos of war and the optimism of the machine age, Art Deco was actually the world saying, the future can be beautiful. It celebrated progress, the hum of electricity, the gleam of steel, the rhythm of jazz. It wasn't nostalgic. It was actually forward-looking. It was confident. It was unapologetically modern. So yes, this is a history story, but one you can walk through, touch, and even live inside. It's the story of how design mirrored hope and how beauty became a language of resilience. Let's dive into the world of Art Deco, where modernity meets beauty and the world learned to dream again. Art Deco, you see it everywhere today, in the sleek lines of velvet tub chairs, in the bold geometry of wallpaper and light fittings, in the burnished gold of Gatsby-inspired interiors. It's having a moment again, though truthfully, I don't think it ever went away. But for all its glamour and visual punch, Art Deco defies easy definition. What exactly is it? Is it a style? Is it a mood? Is it a philosophy? Perhaps it's all three. To understand it, I went looking for answers in the work of Dr. Emma Baston, a historian of the earlier 20th century and one of the sharpest voices on the interwar period. Her research traces Art Deco from its origins in post-war France to its shimmering global influence. And I think she reminds us all that Art Deco isn't just a style. It's a statement. It's a reflection, in many ways, of a world that was in flux. I have to say, it's an odd subject for a podcast. Of course, art being something that we normally see rather than hear. But I think the beauty of Art Deco lies in how deeply it was woven into everyday life. We can still picture it through words, its rhythm, its optimism, its delicate break from the past. The story really begins before the First World War, when the appetite for ornament and classicism still ruled. Then came 1918, and everything changed. The war had shattered old certainties. People were tired of mourning, tired of heaviness, tired of the clutter of the past. They wanted something clean, they wanted something modern and forward-looking, and designers took that energy and they ran with it. By 1925, Paris was ready to show it off. The Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes, a mouthful of a name, but a milestone for modernity, actually marked the moment Art Deco stepped onto the world stage. From there, it spread quickly, from Parisian salons to New York skyscrapers, from ocean liners to cinema halls. By the 1930s, it had become the defining look of the age, glamorous, confident, and sophisticated. Then, of course, came the Second World War, and it all stopped almost overnight. But for 2 glittering decades, Art Deco had captured the spirit of a world reborn. I think it's also worth remembering that Art Deco wasn't a school of art in the traditional sense. There was no manifesto, there was no single founder, there was no governing philosophy, if you like. It was, in fact, the world's first truly global design movement, and it spanned architecture, painting, fashion, graphic design, typography, photography, cinema, even the shape of your coffee pot. The only real constant, I think, was modernity. It looked forward, never back. Gone was the fussy detailing of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. You know, the carved wood, the heavy drapery, and the over decoration. In their place came strong geometry, rich color, and materials that actually gleamed with luxury, or at least they had the illusion of it. And I think perhaps most importantly, Art Deco embraced something earlier movements had often rejected: commerce. It was art for the modern age, industrial, democratic, and accessible. Beauty wasn't something to be locked away in galleries anymore. It could actually live in your home, in your office, even your toaster. Art Deco, in the end, made modernity beautiful, and it made beauty modern. So, where does the name Art Deco come from? Well, like so many great movements, the name was given much later, a neat label applied long after the paint had dried. At the time, no one called it Art Deco. In fact, during the 1920s and 30s, it was simply known as le style moderne, the modern style, or sometimes by one of the many smaller schools and movements that fed into it. It really wasn't seen as a single, unified thing. It wasn't actually until the 1960s that people began to look back at the interwar period and realize that something remarkable had happened. A creative explosion, bookended effectively by two world wars. They needed a name for it, a way to define and package that aesthetic moment. And so scholars began revisiting the Great Paris Exhibition of 1925, l'Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes. And from that title came a convenient shorthand. Art Décoratif became Art Deco. So no one can actually claim credit for coining the term. It was kind of tossed around by antique dealers and a few journalists before an art historian named Bevis Hiller stepped in. In 1968, he wrote a book that would cement it: Art Deco of the 20s and 30s. That was it. The name stuck. Suddenly, the movement had an identity, and people everywhere began seeing the 1920s and the 1930s through that very distinctive, glittering lens. Now, the 1925 Paris exhibition is often described as the birthplace of Art Deco. And of course, this year marks its centenary. But that's not quite true. The exhibition wasn't the beginning. It was the celebration of something that was already underway. Designers had been experimenting with modernism long before 1925. What the exhibition did was codify it. It showcased it. It gave the world a taste of its glamour. Still, the centenary gives us a perfect hook. A moment, I think, to look back and take stock of this extraordinary movement. But was there a single leader, a visionary driving it all? Not really. Art Deco had many fathers, many mothers. It was less a movement with a manifesto than a creative wave that actually swept through everything, from painting to fashion, from architecture to film. And I think you can actually trace its roots to Cubism, Futurism, Vorticism, all these avant-garde ideas about speed, geometry, and modern life. And while there were no official leaders, there were certainly superstars. Take Tamara de Lempicka, Polish artist whose shimmering portraits of women in sculptural poses became the very essence of Deco elegance, all angular grace and sensual poise. Then there was Emile Jacques Ruhlmann, the furniture designer whose creations from the 1925 Expo dripped with luxury, lacquered wood, ivory inlay, the very definition of modern glamour. And René Lalique, the master of glass. His great fountains for that same Paris exhibition seemed almost impossible, like something dreamt from light itself. Across the Atlantic, you had Cedric Gibbons. He was redefining what glamour looked like on screen. He gave Hollywood its deco sheen, those gleaming white sets, those mirrored staircases you see in almost every Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers film. Millions of cinema goers watched those movies, and suddenly everybody wanted a piece of that modern style in their own home. And of course, then there was Georges Lepape, one of the first illustrators to bring Deco into fashion. His work for Vogue and Gazette du Bon Temps helped spread the look, the clean lines, the stylized forms, the sense that modernity itself could actually be chic. These were the stars of the movement, each working in their own medium, but all speaking the same visual language: modernity, luxury, and I think also confidence. It wasn't just the artists and the designers who shaped Art Deco. Businesses saw its potential too. This was, after all, the first commercial art movement, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the grand world of travel. Think of Cunard, for instance. They didn't just build ocean liners, they built floating cathedrals of the modern design. The Normandy and the Queen Mary were temples of Art Deco. From their polished wood paneling and glass murals to the sweeping staircases and mirrored dining rooms. Even Cunard's advertising posters, those bold, streamlined silhouettes of ships cutting through the Atlantic, are Art Deco icons in their own right. You can almost feel the optimism, the speed, the promise of a new world waiting across the ocean. And of course, it wasn't only Cunard. The London Underground embraced the same spirit. Its posters urged Londoners to see the zoo, visit the country, explore the suburbs, all of them rendered in those clean, modernist lines that captured the thrill of the moment. The Underground's architecture became a showcase of Deco elegance, smooth curves, strong geometry, and an unshakable sense of progress. Then there were the manufacturers who made beauty part of daily life. Echo, the British electronics company, transformed radios into works of art. Their circular designs, glossy, futuristic, almost sculptural, looked like nothing that had ever come before. Bakelite glassware sparkled on dinner tables, proving that even mass-produced items could be stylish, tactile, and new. So Art Deco wasn't just a look, it was a language that spoke to both art and commerce. It bridged the worlds of luxury and accessibility, proving that the modern design could be glamorous and also available to the public. When it comes to British Art Deco, though, it has to be said, the UK wasn't quite at the center of the movement. France, America, even Poland and Austria were leading the charge. Still, Britain had its own stars. Architects like Joseph Emberton and Charles Holden gave the country its gleaming modern face. Emberton designed exhibition halls and the striking casino at Blackpool, which was completed in 1939. All white walls, curves, and light. Holden, meanwhile, left his mark on the London Underground, his Piccadilly line stations, Arno's Grove, Southgate, Oakwood. They remain masterclasses in understated deco design, simple, geometric, and unmistakably modern. And of course, there's Clarice Cliff, a name that makes any antiques dealer light up. Her ceramics, sold in department stores rather than galleries, brought Art Deco into ordinary homes. Those bold colors, the hand-painted crocus patterns, the conical sugar shakers. They were playful, they were affordable, and of course they were utterly modern. And her work made design democratic. Furniture designers like Betty Joel took Deco to another level, crafting luxurious pieces that appeared in the pages of Vogue and in the homes of film stars and socialites. Her style was all about craftsmanship meeting modernity, sleek lines, rich materials, and quiet glamour. And again, we circle back to the London Underground because under the guidance of Frank Pick, its posters became some of the most recognizable images of the age. Pick actually gathered a stable of artists to design them, transforming the Underground into what he called the People's Picture Gallery. Through those posters, modernity came alive for the public. Fast trains, bright colors, elegant geometry. It wasn't just transport, it was aspiration. So when we talk about British Art Deco, we're not talking about a single figurehead or manifesto. We're talking about a mindset, a belief that the future could be beautiful, that modern life could have style. And perhaps that's the best way to understand it. To the people of the 1920s and 30s, Art Deco wasn't nostalgia. It was possibility made visible. It's hard for us today to grasp just how much impact Art Deco had on people at the time. We look at it now through the filter of museums and galleries. The rarefied pieces behind glass at the Victorian Albert, the lacquered furniture, the gilded panels, the Lalique glass. All exquisite, yes, but I think they tell only half the story. For every masterpiece preserved in a museum, there were hundreds of smaller, everyday expressions of deco out on the streets. Posters, cinemas, shop fronts, underground stations. Even your average Littlewoods catalogue offered a touch of that modern glamour. You could order an Art Deco mirror for your hallway and, for a moment, feel part of something bold and new. This was modernity you could actually buy into. And that, I think, is the real key to understanding its power. Art Deco wasn't confined to collectors and connoisseurs. It reached ordinary people. It shimmered in the posters they passed on their way to work, the cinemas they escaped to on a Friday night, the radios they gathered around at home. It was absolutely everywhere. So one of the questions a listener asked was, where was Art Deco most visible? Where did it really dominate the landscape? That's a really good question, but it's also a really tricky one to answer because we're looking back a century and we can't walk those streets as they were. But if you imagine London in the late 1920s, you can picture it. The Great West Road, a new artery leading out of the city, lined with sleek, white factories gleaming in the sunlight. Writer J.B. Priestley once described them as the most modern factories in the world. Symbols of progress and hope. Those buildings weren't just functional, they were statements. And then there were the cinemas, the dream palaces of the 1930s, the Rialtos, the Oxfords, the Astorias, the Odeons, all curves, mirrors, and neon. You'd walk through those doors and step straight into the future. Plush carpets, chrome railings, velvet seats. Everything about them screamed glamour. And then on the screen, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers danced beneath Deco chandeliers. The world outside might have been grey and very uncertain, but inside you were part of something golden. Posters too, everywhere you looked. On buses, on billboards, in magazines, bold lines, stylized figures, impossible optimism. You didn't need realism anymore. People had learned to read design, to understand, I think, that a few elegant shapes could actually suggest movement, energy, aspiration. This was an age of growing visual literacy, where images were as eloquent as words. And I think perhaps that's what made Art Deco so intoxicating. It wasn't just a look, it was a feeling. It allowed people to dream again. Priestley once wrote about the young women of the 1930s, typists, shop girls, dancers, all dreaming of being Hollywood starlets. They saw that glamour reflected back at them through Art Deco. The glint of chrome, the sweep of a staircase, the shimmer of silk. It promised escape and transformation. You could live modestly and still own a slice of modernity. For the first time in a long time, design gave people permission to imagine a better life. And that, I think, perhaps is Art Deco's greatest legacy. You could even see it in the smallest things, a beautifully packaged lipstick, a gleaming Art Deco compact. Suddenly you weren't just buying makeup, you were actually buying part of that dream. And just for a moment, you could be Jean Harlow or Greta Garbo, or any of those glittering stars on the silver screen. That, I think, is the magic of Art Deco. It made modernity feel glamorous, attainable, and personal. One of my listeners, a guy called Max, asked how the style reflected the social mood during and after the First World War. Another great question, because the answer really lies in the sense of dreaming. The war had been absolutely catastrophic. Millions dead, entire cities shattered. And then, almost immediately, After the Spanish flu, which swept across the globe, the world was traumatized. And yet, when the dust settled, something remarkable happened. People decided that they'd had enough of mourning, enough of the old world that had dragged them into this abyss, and they wanted to build something new. And I think you can feel that shift in everything at the time: politics, society, art. In Britain alone, new welfare bills were passed. Women won the vote. Salaries rose, education spread, and suddenly the middle class had a little money to spend, and they had dreams to spend it on. The rigid Edwardian order began to crack, and into that gap rushed color, optimism, and style. This was the age of the bright young things, those glittering, reckless youths dancing through London nightclubs, determined to forget the trenches and the funerals. And they also captured a mood, a sense that life could be beautiful again, that laughter and light could return. And that's exactly what Art Deco did. It caught that emotional current and it gave it form. Designers built a world that shimmered with hope. Sharp lines, bold colors, movement everywhere. It was modernity dressed for a party. And you can see it clearly in the posters of the time, those bold graphic railway adverts plastered across train stations. They weren't just selling tickets, they were selling escape. They invited people to take a weekend by the sea, to explore the countryside, to see something beyond their daily grind. And for many, it was the first time travel actually felt possible. Those posters weren't just for decoration. They were a promise that the world could be brighter, cleaner, and simpler, that progress wasn't something to fear, but something to celebrate. And so, while Art Deco's artists and designers were certainly shaping public taste, they were also responding to it, feeding off that same post-war hunger for hope. The public wanted to dream. Deco gave them a language to dream in. I then wondered, were the geometric patterns of Art Deco inspired by ancient motifs, from places like Mesopotamia, South America, Egypt, or Greece? And of course, the answer is yes, absolutely. What makes Art Deco so intriguing is that it manages to look dazzlingly modern while drawing deeply from the ancient world. You can see it not just in the patterns, those zigzags, the chevrons, and the sunbursts, but in the materials themselves. Marble, tavertine, polished stone. These were the building blocks of antiquity reborn. And just as the Greeks loved their columns, so too did Art Deco architects, who borrowed those classical shapes and reimagined them for the 20th century. Sometimes real, sometimes purely decorative, mostly purely for effect. But I then wondered why this fascination with the ancient world, and why then? Well, if you think about it, archaeology in the 20th century was having a moment. It had become a serious science rather than a gentleman's pastime. Excavations were happening all over the world, and thanks to faster communication, discoveries that had been buried for thousands of years were suddenly appearing in newspapers within days. Imagine that. You're sitting at breakfast, coffee in hand, and you see photographs of objects that no human eye has seen for 4,000 years. And I think it's little wonder that archaeology became fashionable at that stage. Agatha Christie herself, married to an archaeologist, even set her murder mysteries among the ruins of Mesopotamia. And her readers loved it. The idea of digging up the past had captured the public imagination. But if there's one discovery that truly shaped the look and the feel of Art Deco, it's this. In 1922, Howard Carter opens the tomb of Tutankhamen. The world goes wild. Egyptomania sweeps through everything, from fashion to film to furniture. Designers actually seized upon the imagery, the golden sheen, the rigid geometry of hieroglyphs, the stylized figures of gods and pharaohs. Suddenly, Egyptian motifs, zigzags, wings, scarabs, and rays of the sun became emblems of the modern age. The irony, of course, is delicious. The future was being built on the aesthetics of the ancient past. And I have to say, the same goes for Greece and Rome. Their influence runs like a clean architectural line through Art Deco. Symmetry, proportion, the sense of order and balance. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autodomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autodomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Take London's 55 Broadway, the London Underground headquarters. At the top of that building sit sculptures of the Four Winds, mythological figures reimagined in bold, modernist forms by Eric Gill and Henry Moore. They're unmistakably inspired by classical myth, yet utterly of their time. Smooth, stylized, dynamic. Across the Atlantic, American designers were looking not to Europe, but to their ancient world. The civilizations of the Aztecs, the Mayan, the Inca. And you see it in the stepped ziggurat shapes of skyscrapers, the triangles, the angular reliefs. For a young nation, these motifs offered something priceless, a sense of heritage, of deep time, and of their own archaeological past. So the great irony of Art Deco is that while it appeared to celebrate modernity, machines, electricity, the future, it was equally obsessed with the ancient world. Its geometry wasn't just futuristic, it was eternal. The problem was, archaeology was still catching up. Much of what they knew was sketchy, pieced together from half-understood discoveries and sensational newspaper stories. So what they created wasn't historical accuracy, it was fantasy. Cinemas, hotels, and department stores became wild hodgepodges of stepped pyramids, ziggurats, stylized serpents, and sunbursts. A glorious cinematic blend of, I think, every exotic influence that they could possibly find. Would it pass cultural scrutiny today? Probably not. But back then, it was an absolute visual feast. An explosion of imagination that actually defined the American skyline. And out of that came some of the most striking buildings of the 20th century. And of course, that brought me to another question. What exactly are speed lines, and why are they so important in Art Deco? And I think the answer is actually beautifully simple. They're exactly what they sound like. Speed lines are lines that show movement. You see them in posters, in sculptures, even architecture. Streaks and arcs that give a sense of acceleration, of momentum. And that sense of speed, I think, is at the very heart of Art Deco. Think about what modern meant in the 1920s and 30s. It actually meant motion. Trains were faster than ever. Cars were roaring down new highways. A lucky few were flying in the first commercial planes. Ocean liners were racing across the Atlantic, setting records every year. Transport wasn't just practical, it was thrilling. And Art Deco, being the visual language of modern life, captured that thrill perfectly. You see it in the sweep of a railway poster, in the chrome curves of a car bonnet, in sculptures where dancers twist and stride, their bodies stretched into fluid arcs of motion. Deco artists love the idea of movement, of capturing speed, vitality, and life. Which brings me neatly to another question. How does Art Deco differ from the movement that came before it, Art Nouveau? Well, they're often mentioned together, but stylistically, they couldn't be more different. Art Nouveau, which flourished from the 1890s up until the First World War, took its inspiration from nature. It's all flowing, sinuous lines, vines, and flowers curling delicately across glass and metal. Think of the Paris metro entrances by Hector Guimard, organic, almost plant-like. Art Deco, on the other hand, stripped all that away. Gone were the curves and the blossoms. In came geometry, symmetry, and shine. Deco was crisp, where Nouveau was fluid. Square, where it was serpentine. Put the two side by side and you'll see it instantly. One, I think, whispers of nature, the other hums with machinery. Yet for all their differences, the two movements were connected by a shared ambition. Both wanted to bring beauty into everyday life. Both believed art shouldn't live only in galleries, but in people's homes, on the streets, and of course in stations. Art Nouveau lit the spark, but I think Art Deco carried it forward into the age of the machine. Before Art Deco swept the world, there was the artists of the Art Nouveau movement, people like Alphonse Mucha, Hector Guimard, Louis Comfort Tiffany, began to challenge that divide. They believed beauty should belong to everyone, not just the elite. Why shouldn't the world around us be beautiful? Why shouldn't everyday objects be art? And so they began to design the world anew. Silver teapots, Tiffany lamps, wrought iron railings that curved like vines. Everything was organic and fluid and alive, and it was an attempt to bring art into everybody's daily life, to make the world itself a gallery. Of course, the problem was it wasn't built for the modern age. So Art Nouveau was exquisite, yes, but intricate and time-consuming and very expensive. You couldn't mass-produce it, not in the new industrial factories that were reshaping the 20th century. And so, ironically, the movement that wanted to democratize beauty priced itself out of reach. And of course, this is where Art Deco stepped in. It took Art Nouveau's dream, beauty for the masses, and translated it into the language of the machine. Out went the delicate curves and tendrils. In came clean lines, symmetry, and simplicity. Art Deco was the art that could be made, not just imagined. It embraced the position of the factory and turned industrial production into something absolutely bloody glamorous. I think the two movements are actually linked like parent and child, one born of nature, the other of modernity, but both driven by the same desire to make art part of everyday life. And I think you see that clearly in the 1925 Paris exposition. The French exhibits, with their lavish craftsmanship and exotic materials, still carried the spirit of Art Nouveau, but their look was undeniably modern, streamlined, confident, glittering with promise. The world had changed, and so had art. When I asked Emma about her own favorites from the Art Deco world, for me, she said, it all began with the fashion illustrations. She had always been fascinated by sewing, by the tactile beauty of fabric and form, and one day she stumbled across old dress patterns from the 1920s and 1930s. The illustrations were extraordinary, she said, so elegant, so otherworldly. The women in them were impossibly elongated, impossibly glamorous. They didn't look real at all. But she says that was part of their magic. So she began collecting old Vogue magazines, marveling at the artistry of the fashion plates, the sharp angles, the confident lines, the sense of movements. Those drawings, she told me, were Art Deco in miniature, a whole aesthetic distilled into one perfect image. And now, as part of her research, she spends her days leafing through the Vogues of the 1920s and 1930s. It's heaven, she laughs. Every page is a portal into that world, a world that believed in the beauty of the future. I can't help but agree. I think what's wonderful about Art Deco is that you don't have to go to Paris or New York to see it. It's right there, often hidden in plain sight. Take a stroll down your local high street and look up. Above the shop signs, you might just spot the clean lines and stepped facades of a 1930s Marks & Spencer, a Woolworths or a Burton's. Those buildings are actually living fragments of the interwar dream, everyday architecture designed to bring a touch of modernity to ordinary lives. The Victoria and Albert Museum, one of my favorites, has a stunning collection, of course, but you don't have to step inside a museum to find deco. Scotland, for instance, boasts some magnificent examples from cinemas to seaside hotels. And as I've mentioned, London's underground, that great artery of the capital, embraced Art Deco wholeheartedly. Its stations, its posters, and topography turned commuting into an aesthetic experience. And much of that collection is now lovingly archived online, ready for everyone to explore. The truth is, once you start looking, you see deco everywhere. A mirror frame, a staircase, a hotel lobby, the curve of a building you've passed 100 times without even noticing. It's there in the fonts, in the furniture, even in those velvet tub chairs in your favorite restaurant. And the exciting thing is, a century on, we're still living with its legacy, proof that good design never really fades. And I think that's also the challenge of preservation. Many surviving deco buildings stand abandoned, deemed out of date. Their brilliance dulled by time and neglect. But I think with a little imagination, a bit of care, those buildings could live again, repurposed for modern life while still carrying the story of their time. They're not just concrete and glass. They're the physical echoes of a world that believed in progress, in beauty, and in hope. After all, Art Deco was joyful. That was its essence. It was born out of the trauma of war, yet it absolutely refused to be gloomy. It shimmered, it sparkled, it dreamed. And 100 years later, it still invites us to look upward, to notice the detail, the symmetry, and the optimism carved into our cities. As Emma said before we wrapped up the interview, there's so much more to discover. And I think with this podcast, it's only really skimmed the surface. Every Art Deco enthusiast finds their own niche. Fashion, architecture, poster art, even cosmetics, packaging. Emma's, fittingly, is the fashion illustration. Those elegant, elongated figures that made modernity look effortless. And maybe that's the beauty of Art Deco. There's a little bit of it for everyone. So with that in mind, folks, go out and find yours. I guarantee you, no matter what city you're in, you'll find it. Wander your streets, lift your gaze above the signs and spot the traces of that extraordinary moment between the wars when the world dared to believe again. Art Deco was never just a style. It was a statement of joy. And if you can feel even a flicker of that joy a century later, then its magic still works. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.